Folks, I've put you on mute for now. Good afternoon, folks. 12:01. I can legally say good afternoon. So let's wait a couple of minutes. We don't have a lot of people here. Maybe the daily reminder would have helped, but it's the last week before the last week. What can we say? Yeah, it's YouTube. 4 people are watching YouTube, or at least that's what it says. So we have some folks over there. Just a couple of minutes and we'll get going. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started, folks? Oh, everyone's welcome to keep their video off. And Colin, glad you're eating. I think that was kind of the purpose of bringing the colloquium at noontime, saying, you know, long term when we are in the room to encourage participation, everyone brings their lunch, or God forbid, if we have money, maybe we cater something. So you're doing it right. I wish I could eat right now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last colloquium of the year. I'm going to be putting everyone on mute if you don't mind. There it is. You made it, or have we? There's another week left. Today we have 2 of our own very exciting PhD exit talks. We'll have both talks, hopefully with questions and answers, wrapped up in about an hour. Because the speakers are familiar, I will keep it very much short and invite the speakers to go ahead and get started. For folks on YouTube, questions on the right-hand side in the chat box, you need to be signed in. I see you already have a comment from Adam saying, "You go gals." I was obligated to read that for you. With that, let me invite first Dr. Shae Frydenlund for her talk entitled Securitization, Surplus Populations and Embodied Frontiers in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Shae, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I think all can be assured that I am absolutely over the moon to be here. I miss I miss our department very much, and very much look forward to being able to convene in person and come and visit at some point. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here.
Looks good.
All right, great. Thank you for having me today. As we gather, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses around the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge that the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. I've been looking forward to sharing my dissertation research with you since I finished last year, and I'm eager to revisit the project in the company of dear friends, colleagues, and mentors, as many of you helped shape my thinking on capitalism, labor, race, and migration in critical ways. Today, I'm going to speak about my work on refugee labor in Malaysia's food industry, The work I'm sharing is based on a dissertation chapter that I rewrote as a journal article as part of a special issue on frontiers in the journal Geopolitics. This work is one part of a larger set of projects that investigate refugee employment, social reproduction, and capitalist development in cities linked through the transnational Burmese and especially Rohingya diaspora. As we meet here on Zoom as members of a class of workers whose labor has been effectively digitized during the pandemic, it is also clear that some work cannot be spatially unmoored from its material location. Food industry work, as we all know, is one such example. In this talk, I'll be exploring the phenomenon of what I call in situ labor frontiers, which are forged from the bodies of people who are marked surplus to capital and to nation states. I'll show how historical processes of racialization and securitization articulate with the imperatives of food industry capitalism to position Rohingya refugees as unfree labor, and in so doing, create novel conditions for delivering cheap work to capital, or what I call labor frontier making. In doing so, I situate immigration crises in what Alison Mounts has termed the death of asylum within the realm of capitalist production. I'm speaking to you in a moment of rising economic crises and democratic crises worldwide amid an ongoing military coup in Myanmar and untold unemployment globally during the pandemic. Around the world, mass displacement, increasingly restrictive immigration practices, and the expansion of precarious and unfree labor regimes are reframing questions about the fate of so-called surplus populations and invigorating old Marxist debates about the role of unfree labor in capitalism. Taking the cruel spectacle of immigration security as a point of departure, the aim of this work is to make visible the productive effects of immigration crises, who benefits, who is disadvantaged, and why. I also aim to show that a population often assumed to be irrelevant to capital is actively enrolled in capitalist systems at multiple scales.
Shae, I'm sorry for the interruption. Just checking in. You're still on your first slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I was
now
just about to move to the second one.
Wanted to make sure the screen was working. Thank you.
Yeah. The crisis. Hamida's husband, Mohammed, was out of breath when he called me just after 9 p.m. on October 16th, 2018. Come quick to have a look for your research, he said. There's an operasi immigration raid at the market and lots of people are arrested. I dressed quickly and rushed out of the home I shared with Hamida, Mohammed, and their family. Luckily, Mohammed, who did not have the UNHCR card that generally protects refugees from detention, had escaped on foot before he could be caught. By the time I arrived at the corner where hawkers usually gathered to sell cast-off produce, police cars and a half dozen lorries had blocked the intersection. 30 or so people sat on the pavement in rows of 10 with their hands behind their heads. Meanwhile, plainclothesmen in navy polo shirts tossed crates of confiscated produce into the trucks as another policeman took photos with a digital camera. When I asked what was going on, an immigration officer gestured at the seated men and women. They are illegal immigrants, he said. What they are doing is illegal. They undercut the prices of Malaysian sellers, which causes a lot of problems. Many of them have fake refugee cards. With this, the immigration officer delivered a succinct read of Rohingyas as a racialized population that is dangerously surplus to both capital and the Malaysian citizenry. Reflecting the colonialist and biopolitical projects of administering the racial feelings of a privileged Malay citizenry, refugees in oversupply are thought to tip the balance of racial peace in the country. In particular, the problems the officer identifies refer more specifically to the threat of racial violence and economic chaos, stemming from perceptions that foreigners have a larger share of the nation's wealth than Malays, a point of significance that frames both contemporary immigration crisis and the political economy of labor in the country. Joining with the imperatives of spatially anchored food industry capital, the securitization of racialized bodies marked surplus creates conditions of labor unfreedom, understood here as the coerced positioning of workers in specific sectors, and also works as a lever for food industry capital to apply downward pressure to wages, a tool for labor frontier making. So Alison Mounts has written that crises do political work, bringing this question in conversation with the political economy of forced displacement. This research asks, what economic work does Malaysia's immigration crisis do? More specifically, pairing the core insights of feminist political geography with Black Marxism, Marxian labor geography, and world ecology approaches to capitalist development, I ask, what are the economic effects of racializing and securing bodies that are marked surplus to capital and nation states? In this talk, I focus on historically specific processes of racialization and embodied securitization, which join to anchor refugees in food sector work and critically devalue refugees' lives and labor. More broadly, what I conceptualize as the process of creating new sources of cheapened labor and delivering that labor to capital. A brief note on the structure of this also brief talk. I'll first situate the population that I'm working with, give a brief discussion of methods, and then talk briefly about the theoretical framework, interrogating surplus populations and labor frontiers, then focus on two historically specific processes of racialization and securitization to then describe what I call labor frontier making as processes characterized by, as a process characterized by labor and freedom, the offloading of devaluation, and subsidizing the good life of a privileged Malay class. Rohingya refugees are historically native to the northwest state of Rakhine in Myanmar, and this research focuses mainly on their experiences and the experiences of people who have fled Myanmar from Malaysia since the 1970s. The largest number of Rohingya and Myanmar Muslim refugees fled during the anti-Muslim pogroms of 2012 and the military perpetrated genocide in 2017. And in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you can see in red Malaysia. To zoom in a bit further, my research site is located in the city of Selayang, about 10 miles north of Kuala Lumpur. A brief note about methods. This research focuses and is part of a broader suite of feminist geography methods that prioritize the body, the scale of the everyday, alongside the factory floor to interrogate refugees' world of work and the broader structures that position them as they are. I'm drawing mostly on interviews with employers and people on the factory floor in this work, as well as workers' inquiry surveys, which I'd be happy to talk about in question and answer. Originally, I began this project with the question of why refugees come to be positioned as cheap labor, which conventionally would lead me to an analysis foregrounding reserve armies of labor and so-called surplus populations. Yet thinking more closely about the immigration officer's comments in the opening vignette led me to revisit the concept of surplus populations itself. Both Marx's original theorization of surplus populations and Tanya Lee's extension of Marx hold that when labor is in oversupply, it is more effectively disciplined and cheapened, and capital has no incentive to reproduce the lives of workers. The opposite is true when demand for labor is high. However, I suggest that oversupplied workers are actually a specific type of labor that is connected and disconnected to a specific type of capital. In the case of refugee workers at Pasar Borong Market, this labor is racialized and securitized, then forcibly connected and disconnected to food industry capital. Put another way, this labor is unfree. Extending Jason Moore, who takes a world ecology approach to capitalist development, I consider the specific processes of reproducing racial capitalism, understood as the imbrication of racialism within capitalism itself, through the production of labor frontiers, understood as a process of devaluing life marked as surplus and continuously delivering new sources of racialized, securitized, and unfree labor to capital. My purpose in viewing refugee bodies through this lens is to unpack the spectacle of market immigration rates and interrogate the concept of oversupplied bodies as a historically and geographically specific process with effects far outside the realm of immigration. Moving deeper into the problem of Rohingya refugees' oversupply in Malaysia reveals it is not simply their numbers, but the racialization and securitization of refugee bodies that creates conditions for labor frontier making through conditions of labor unfreedom. Now, I briefly turn to the interconnected processes of racialization and securitization that mark Rohingya refugee bodies as dangerously surplus to Malaysian capital and the Malaysian nation state. Framing migrants and UNHCR cardholders, those formally recognized as those with formally verified claims of asylum, Framing these people as threats to the economy and the Malaysian citizenry has powerful material effects where even those who have legitimate claims to asylum through the UNHCR can then be rendered illegitimate and dangerous as frauds and potential terrorists. Once positioned as illegal immigrants and what Alison Mounts has termed bogus refugees, Rohingyas become cornered into specific sectors absent any form of recourse, legal or otherwise. This New Straits Times article from 2016 reads, "The country is being swamped by foreigners hiding behind fake refugee cards." And in the text of the article, the most important phrase is that their intentions are assumed to be sinister. Several articles like this also emphasize Rohingya refugees, though also Muslim in a Muslim majority country in Malaysia, their ties and potential ties to ISIS and other radical Muslim organizations, as well as their untrustworthy character. This positioning cannot be separated from the situated history of colonialist immigration policies that secured the bodies of immigrant workers and slotted those workers into racially segmented labor markets on plantations and in tin mines. This is part of the broader biopolitical project of improving, famously in the 1970s, rollout of the new economic policy that was a response to revanchist attacks on Chinese Malaysians perceived to be in control of a broader share of the Malaysian economy than native-born sons of the soil, Bumiputra Malaysians themselves. That this biopolitical project rolled out in 1970 that improves the well-being of the Malay racial group and the Malaysian citizen population extends colonial projects that administer the racial feelings of Malays who were chosen by the British as the rightful owners of Malaysia. Today, Malaysian citizens are increasingly grouped alongside ethnic Malays as these rightful owners, in contrast to illegal migrant workers, immigrants, and refugees who shift the balance of racial peace in the country and reflect a shift in immigration security from the border to the bodies of non-citizen workers. Now, turning to the empirics of this research on the factory floor and among employers, Malaysian citizens themselves, labor unfreedom appears as a critical condition of labor frontier making, or the delivery of cheapened and devalued labor and life to capital. This is justified by racialized assumptions about the needs of Rohingya refugees, Rohingyas' assumed surplusness, and their non-citizen status. In one trenchant observation, Mr. Lee here explains, "If I hired a Malaysian, I would have to pay 100 to 200 RM per day, or 3,000 RM, about $800 in 2018, per month. Malaysians need to pay rent, pay for their cars and motorcycles, their children's education. Myanmar people need only to pay small rents and eat. So 40 RM, about 950 in 2018 RM, is enough for them. They don't have any choice. This is the only job they can get. They can work here or in construction because they have no documents." Mr. Lee references both the existence and intensity of what Marx calls the forces of compulsion that corner Rohingyas in the least strictly monitored, spatially anchored industries in the country, or what I call conditions of labor and freedom. He explicates the relationship between the racialization and securitization of refugees, where the devaluation of refugee work is justified by the assumedly simple needs of stateless and undocumented people, contrasted to the needs of more developed Malaysian citizens who are entitled to live in what Catherine McKittrick and Heidi Nast have called the biopolis, where the good life for privileged citizenries is built through what they call racial subsidies. The second feature of labor frontier making is characterized by offloading of devaluation. Supermarkets in the Kuala Lumpur area have curated large networks of farms that have the capacity to hire administrative employees who can quickly compare prices between dozens and sometimes hundreds of farms and importers. Produce and fruit prices vary constantly, especially in years when high volumes of rain ruins crops. Prices raised overnight, threatening to leave distributors with a mass of produce or poultry that they cannot sell. For produce distributors at Pasar Borong Market, competition with these supermarkets makes passing on the cost to consumers impossible. Miss Betty, a 60-year-old Chinese Malaysian distributor, hires workers daily or weekly based on short-term work, not necessarily to compete with supermarkets' economies of scale and overall low prices, but to compete with the speed at which supermarkets can read the food market, and then the speed at which they can offload the cost of devalued capital or destroyed unsellable produce, or produce that is too expensive to sell, onto workers who are then left to fend to them for themselves without a day's wages. Miss Betty explains, the Rohingyas come every day looking for work in the market, so we hire them by the day. Prices are high and I can't find a better price for another farm before the morning. I hire only 1 or 2 workers, or I don't operate at all. This, of course, is a common narrative that we can relate to experiences of undocumented migrant workers in the United States, where day labor is justified by employers on the basis of their own inability to afford to pay the full cost of labor. But what this specific context reveals is something interesting about devaluation itself, and how the speed at which devaluation can be offloaded is a critical component of how and why refugee workers are employed at the produce market. Produce distributors continually accumulate surplus value by moving large volumes of low value added produce in a labor intensive manner, by ensuring that this labor is disciplined, flexible, and low wage. But they can only do so if workers' lives are cheapened and they are unable to sell their labor to other sectors. And if they are under threat of arrest and detention, conditions of labor unfreedom, and broader processes of labor frontier making that are made possible by the death of asylum and the inability to claim social protections. Lastly, I turn to Mr. Chan's slaughterhouse. It's the largest in the Pasar Borong area and processes up to 12,000 birds per day, a few blocks away from Pasar Borong market. After paying operating costs, Mr. Chan takes away about 3,000 RM per month in the slow season, though he evaded the question of whether this was payment for his own labor or profit beyond a salary. He spends most of his money on an apartment, payments on his car, a motorcycle, and is, interestingly, saving profits from the slaughterhouse to expand his business into seafood. When I asked Mr. Chan if he would still be in business if he was forced to employ an all-Malaysian workforce, he said yes, he would. This answer was surprising in that it challenges the commonly held assumption that capitalist competition, especially among sectors that hire large numbers of undocumented people, in the age of globalized commodity chains, that these employers are compelled to cut labor costs to be competitive enough to stay in business. To the contrary, Mr. Chan's admission of profit making reveals the fact that opportunism, based on racialized assumptions about refugee needs and surplusness, is a central facet of labor regimes in Kuala Lumpur's food industry, and likely elsewhere. Moreover, Mr. Chan's prosperity in 2018, this prosperity, which I'd be happy to talk about in question and answer, has changed markedly since the onset of COVID-19 and a ban on the employment of undocumented asylum seekers and migrants in this market. Nevertheless, in 2018, this prosperity hinged upon surplus extracted from racialized Rohingya refugee workers, and his expansion into seafood business reflects the reproduction of racial capitalism itself. So to revisit the central question driving this portion of my research, what economic work is done by Malaysia's immigration crisis? I argue that racialization and embodied securitization join to position refugee surplus populations as an in situ labor frontier for spatially anchored produce and poultry industries, and that labor frontier making enables continued accumulation, offloads the cost of devaluation, and subsidizes the good life for a petty capitalist class of Malaysians. And to conclude, refugee experiences and employer practices in Saliang demonstrate that surplus populations are not ready-made through displacement and immigration, and likewise, displacement is not a ready-made fix for overaccumulation. Rather, capitalist frontiers and labor frontiers specifically are actively made by racializing and securing the bodies of people who are marked surplus in oversupply to states and capital. Rohingyas and Myanmar Muslims positioning as unfree workers who are locked in specific sectors and provide cheap labor to these sectors. This cannot be explained by the fact that they are vulnerable people who are compelled to move to Malaysia. Rather, unfree labor in the food industry, characterized by the devaluation of workers' lives, is possible through the racialization and securitization of bodies themselves. In a combination of serendipity and strategy, as Jason Moore calls it, unfree refugee labor has become a source of prosperity for many middle-class Malaysians in the slaughter and vegetable industry. Beyond the marketplace, the prosperity of Kuala Lumpur itself, a global hub for finance and trade in Southeast Asia, is intimately linked to the regional market workers who provide cheap produce and meat to restaurants, cafeterias, and middle-class homes. Despite vilifying refugees as surplus to the Malaysian economy and nation state, social and economic life in Kuala Lumpur is reproduced only through the refugee labor that feeds, builds, and maintains the city. Returning to the question of what market immigration raids do beyond the realm of immigration, though immigration police regularly raided Pasar Borong before 2020, arresting and detaining several dozen to several hundred workers in an average night. Most workers, including those whom I lived with, escaped on foot through the maze of the open air market. Few were actually deported, and immigration police, unlike street police, do not usually demand bribes from undocumented people. This leads the perceptive observer to question the actual purpose of market immigration raids. In my findings, the threat of fines imposed by immigration serves reflecting the work of Mark Dussard and among greengrocers in Chicago. This serves as another lever to cheapen refugee work by claiming that the fees that would be paid should these workers be caught are and should be deducted from and held against the salaries otherwise paid to undocumented people. So here, the imperatives of capital also do not always align with the Malaysian state's biopolitical objectives, creating slippages and contradictions that reveal weaknesses in each structure. Policing, detaining, and deporting undocumented people, many of whom are desperate to apply for asylum, contradicts the state's ability to reproduce the conditions necessary for capitalism and racial capitalism itself. It would seem against the state's interest to erode the base of social reproduction in its largest city by terrorizing food industry workers, a misalignment that becomes acutely visible when produce suppliers lose half their workforce in an overnight immigration raid and downtown restaurants find themselves without morning vegetables and meat. And so with that, I'd like to end, and I'd be happy to talk about next chapters, including work in which I examine the role of gendered unpaid labor in reproducing racial capitalism and the city of Kuala Lumpur itself, as well as other cities in the Myanmar refugee diaspora. And so I'd like to thank Professor Emily Yeh, the NSF, CU Boulder Geography, of course, and my friends, Farida and Ibrahim, Shinley and Nariza, who assisted me in collecting this data, and everybody in Seliang who shared their time and knowledge. In closing, I'd like to show you a photo of a very joyous day, because so much of the research on refugees and displaced people and Rohingyas especially echoes what Ruthie Gilmore has called doomed methods of analysis, where undocumented and racialized people are continuously represented as less than human. But in this day, we were at the park, we were blowing bubbles and experiencing joy, even amid conditions that make eking a living increasingly difficult. So thank you so much again. And I very much look forward to Siwang's presentation and our discussion.
Thank you so much, Shae. We have 25 folks across YouTube and Zoom. We'll first go with the questions on Zoom and then see if the delayed broadcast on YouTube elicits some question. I must apologize to Shae. I should have mentioned, not everyone knows, she's a postdoctoral fellow, and if I'm saying this right, a global shifts postdoctoral fellow at UPenn, University of Pennsylvania. So Shae, while we miss you, we're glad you're not here. If you know what I mean. On the Zoom side, questions. This was a very interesting talk. I feel very out of place, so I'm not going to be even pretending that I can ask a scholarly question here. Fernando, please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shae. Very interesting talk. I was wondering, as you were giving the talk, it seemed to me like I wasn't sure. Could you clarify whether the wave of Rohingya refugees seeking refuge in Malaysia is that exacerbating a process of capitalist frontier formation that, I mean, it sounds like you mentioned that it started with basically the, kind of division or the creation of this, division and othering of the Chinese, ethnic Chinese Malaysians, decades ago. But more recently, has there been other kinds of, migration into Malaysia that this exacerbated, or is this a reformation of that frontier?
So that's a really good question, because refugees are distinguished both through legal mechanisms in terms of migrant labor visas, migrant worker visas, that there are many, many undocumented. There are over 1 million. Numbers range between 2 and 3 million, upwards of 3 million undocumented migrant workers in Malaysia. Now, refugees are counted broadly within that population because so many don't have UNHCR cards. They're not counted as refugees, either because they couldn't get interviews at the UNHCR because that process is so difficult, or because their claims weren't seen as legitimate in the eyes of the UNHCR. And so refugees and people who are seeking asylum are separated from Indonesians, not only on the basis of there are these long-standing networks that link migrants from Indonesia to Malaysia for many, many generations. So there are worker visas, temporary migrant visas, that account for many of the non-citizen workers in Malaysia. But even among those who are in that huge number of undocumented workers, Indonesian people are differentiated from Rohingyas on the basis, that slide that I showed about fake refugees. Indonesians are seen as, they share the language. Bahasa Malay and Bahasa Indonesia are very close. They share a language. They share oftentimes what are recognized as phenotypical similarities. And so people who are racialized as being Bengali, which, as we know in the case of Myanmar, is not true. They are Burmese people who come from a mixed background on the borderlands that have been historically fluid, the borderlands between the Chittagonian hill tracts and the, what is today northwestern Myanmar, that was the Kingdom of Arakan. But even in Malaysia, they're being racialized as Bengali in the same way that Rohingyas are racialized as Bengali in Myanmar. And so we see this interesting, it's a point for future research of how these processes of racialization are jumping and being reproduced in countries, secondary countries of asylum. And so broadly, to answer your question, Rohingya refugees and Myanmar Muslim refugees, those who are profiled as Burmese-speaking people of South Asian phenotype, are distinguished from Indonesians and other, nationals who are seen as closer to Malaysian. Of course, Indonesians are likewise paid terrible wages and have insecurity, but that market, Pasar Borong market, before 2020 and the outside of the pandemic, was almost entirely run by Rohingya refugees. And now, a sort of teaser for future research, we're seeing Chinese Malaysian families, the owners of those stalls, like Mr. Chan, Miss Betty, Mr. Lee, they're enrolling their family members because they not only have Malaysian citizens who are legally obliged, these people are the produce market employers are legally prohibited on threat of caning from employing undocumented refugees and migrants. Malaysian citizens are demanding not 100 RM, the minimum wage, they're demanding 200 and 300 RM per day to work at Pasar Borong. The Chinese, even though Mr. Lee and Mr. Chan could afford to pay 100 RM, they can't afford to pay 200 RM. So Chinese families, Chinese Malaysian families for the most part, are depending on the unwaged labor of other family members to keep the market business afloat.
Thank you. And we started late, but let's do one last question. And Shae, in the meanwhile, if you don't mind, please go ahead and share your screen.
I think Tim has a hand.
I did not see him. Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
our classic Zoom thing. I can wait if we need to move on to Shae.
You are welcome to go ahead.
Well, I'll make it quick. Just an observation and then a quick question. I mean, the observation is just how interesting the talk was, Shae, about the power of borders, right? How productive borders are for capital, and just, you know, I mean, I think you understand this as well as anybody, but so much of the discourse of circulation and flows about how capitalism works can really be disrupted by the kind of work that you're doing that really shows how productive borders are to the way capitalism works. So I just wanted to observe that. And then the question, though, has to do with varieties of capital and whether and how that matters. Most of what you're working on, it seemed like, is in that kind of very small scale, entrepreneurial, petty capitalism, almost informal kinds of economic activities. How might what you're arguing be changed if we consider other forms of capital as the kind of process or system through which, you know, refugee production of unfree labor might work, or is this only relevant to these particular forms of capital that you've been looking at?
Thanks, Tim. So I think one of the aims of the broader dissertation project is to connect that scale of, you know, so-called informal labor from unpaid social reproduction labor and unpaid work in the home to global scale capitalism. I don't quite get all the way there in terms of global capitalism, but the argument is advanced by looking at the specific ways that refugee labor is harnessed by cities, and how the scale of the municipality and the successes and prosperity of entire cities is advanced through the seizure, the appropriation, and the exploitation of refugee labor. And so in the case of Kuala Lumpur, the next step is looking at changes that I've seen during the pandemic, where now refugees who can no longer work at the market are being hired by the city again. They had, you know, been in 2016, 2017, then broadly shifted to the market. They're being hired by the city to work as sanitation workers and street sweepers. And then in Kuala Lumpur, there's also the broad employment of refugees at mask and glove and other PPE factories. In the United States, refugees' employment in factories, also in the food and food production industry and meat packing, is part of a not only nation state scale, but also global supply chain of meat and produce that I think has significance not only at the local scale of, say, Aurora or Greeley, or the state scale, but also, you know, in terms of circuits of capital that connect meat and produce between China, Malaysia, the United States, Brazil. And so I think that that is certainly part of the argument that will be spelled out in my book project. All right.
Thank you so much. I wish we were in person and we'll give you a round of applause here. Today we're gonna, I think, stay until 1:15 because we started late, and also it feels good to break the rules on the last colloquium. Thanks again. I want to invite Wang. She's an ABD. She's about to defend, my understanding is. Her talk is entitled Coal Generation Overcapacity in China, the Consequences of Building a Fossil Fuel Empire. Before you get started, let's do a quick test. It looked good when we did the testing, but now I see a square on top. Can you go to your second slide and come back real quick to see if that thing disappears? Perfect. It works perfectly fine. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I couldn't see it on my end, so thanks for having me run that. Yeah, thanks so much for having me for this exit talk. It was really cool to hear Shae's talk, and actually, like Shae, I also addressed the themes of capital and labor in my talk, so I think it'll be really interesting to just like think about those themes across both talks today. I also want to say I noticed a few people in the audience who've heard this talk before, so I just ask for their patience, and I appreciate that they showed up. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that the land on which the University of Colorado is situated on is the ancestral homeland of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and the Ute Nations. So my dissertation examines the case of coal generation overcapacity in China, which fundamentally means that there are too many coal power plants and not enough power demand to warrant the plants that have been built. So that means that generation overcapacity in China it's important for many reasons, but the top two that I'll highlight here in my talk today is that China has the largest electricity sector in the world. At last count, it had at least 1,800 gigawatts of installed generation capacity. And for reference, the US had 1,150 gigawatts of installed generation capacity last year. So the size of China's system is about 1.5 times that of the US at this point. And so when you have any kind of overcapacity on a system of that size, that's really not nominal at all. And China has also been the top emitter of greenhouse gas emissions annually, accounting for 28% of global annual GHG. And so such generation overcapacity has really severe consequences for the future of the climate.
Shae, I hate to interrupt again. The static situation is a little worse. Are you using the right microphone? If not, I hope folks can just be patient with the...
Yeah, I'm gonna try something. Is this better?
Oh, 100 times.
Okay. Did
Perfect.
folks sort of hear what I said, or should I go over that again?
I think so. I was able to absorb it all.
Get it? Okay, great. So I've kind of defaulted into my internal mic on my laptop. So for my talk today, I'll provide an overview of Chinese coal generation overcapacity and the main research questions that I ask in my dissertation. And the first half of my dissertation explains why there is so much coal generation overcapacity in China. And then the second half of my dissertation zooms in on the territory of Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, to investigate the localized labor, environmental, and social justice impacts of excess coal power plant development. And specifically for today's talk, I'll focus more on the second part of my dissertation, and more specifically on how coal power overcapacity has affected construction workers who build these coal plants. So it is estimated that China has an extra 200 to 300 gigawatts of excess capacity, which is enough power to power almost any country in the world except the top 6. It is also enough capacity to meet China's power demands for the next decade, even assuming a 5% GDP growth, which it hasn't really been seeing recently. And as you can see on this graph, this overcapacity in the Chinese power system began showing up in the early 2010s as a large number of power plants was added to the system. As represented by the bars using the left axis for scale, while growth in electricity demand dropped, represented by the black line using the right y-axis for scale. So between 2006 and 2016, which extends a few years off of this chart, 90 gigawatts of new capacity was added annually to China's grid, which is the equivalent of adding the United Kingdom's entire power generation fleet every single year onto the Chinese power grid. And because other types of generation, such as hydroelectricity and wind generation, was also being added, the absolute total electricity generated from coal plants has been declining since the early 2010s. And power generation overcapacity means that there's too much supply and not enough demand. So coal plants are capital investments, and when we have too much supply and not enough consumption, power plant investors are worried about the returns that they're getting in a saturated market. So to address this overcapacity, the National Energy Administration, the NEA, which is a central level energy and agency, issued a series of directives like this one that I show an image of between 2016 and 2017. So these NEA directives suspended 100 gigawatts of under construction coal plants. It prevented the interconnection of completed coal plants to the grid, and then it also halted approval for proposed plants. And in total, this affected about 200 projects. For those who don't read Chinese, this is basically a 2016 NEA document suspending under construction plants, specifically in the area that I looked at in Inner Mongolia. And curiously, by 2018, the NEA suspensions were lifted and coal generation construction has returned in full force, which you may or may not have read about, but that has been making the news, especially in the last 2 months. So when I was in Beijing, I heard a lot of explanations about this from energy scholars and researchers. And boiled down, these apolitical explanations argue that the overcapacity is an error. They say that it's the result of bad planning and mistaken assumptions about the economy. And for me, this is really not enough to explain the sheer scale of the overcapacity, which is around 200 to 300 gigawatts, and why the NEA suspended only new plants and not existing operational ones, and why these suspensions only lasted for a short period of time, about 2 years. So given the severity of coal generation overcapacity and the way that the central state responded via the NEA, I ask 2 additional questions in my dissertation. The second question is, why did the central state suspend under construction and newly completed projects instead of retiring older, less efficient, and higher polluting plants, and only temporarily? So I'm saying with question 2 that there's a sequencing problem here. And then 3, who wins and who loses from such decisions? So to answer these questions, I spent 18 months conducting fieldwork in China. I had 2 main field sites. I conducted fieldwork in Beijing to understand the central level approaches to energy governance. And then my regional fieldwork, as I mentioned earlier, took place in Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, which is highlighted in this marine blue in northern China. So I chose Inner Mongolia because it has the highest rate of cogeneration development from the 2000s through the mid-2010s. And then it also ranks second nationally in terms of installed coal generation capacity. So my primary field site within Inner Mongolia is a small city in the middle of that territory called Silinghauta. And it is a city of 200,000, so it's roughly about twice the size of Boulder, that is surrounded by grasslands, and historically the main livelihood here has been pastoralism. So this is an overhead image of Silinghauta, specifically of the industrial zone where all these power plants are situated. And this is an image from late 2018. So you can see at the bottom of the image, there are 2 operational plants that already exist in that city, and that's plants A and B, and that there are 3 additional plants under construction at that time, which is plant C, plant D, which is a little bit off the image. It's about a mile east off the image, and then plant E, which is in the top left. So aside from the 2 main field sites, I also visited under construction and operational plants in 7 other sites in Inner Mongolia, as well as talked to engineers and power plant managers in 3 other cities in southern China. I spoke in total with 160 respondents, which included people in the power generation, power grid, power plant construction industries, as well as the coal mining industry. I also talked to local people and villagers that were being affected by plant construction, as well as energy researchers and consultants. So I'm going to try to answer this step by step. To address this overarching question of Q1, my dissertation argues that the overcapacity is not a mistake, but is instead deliberate. And this image this is a neat image showing the astronomical growth in China's global trade from 1995 to 2018. And China's total is actually all the stacked blue areas combined, and the exports are above the x-axis and the imports are below the x-axis. But what I really want you to notice is this dark red line, which shows the surplus China has been getting from exporting more than it has been importing. And if you notice the scale on the left, it's in trillions of US dollars. So China's export economy has produced a surplus of capital relative to the opportunities to use it in its domestic economy. In other words, it has too much financial, material, and labor resources and not enough investment outlets for productive returns. And if we think about it, we actually see evidence of all of this around us for the last decade. So if you've ever picked up a financial paper like the Financial Times or Bloomberg, you'll see reporting of a glut of Chinese commodities that cannot, really be absorbed by its economy, such as solar panels or cheap steel, and that it instead is flooding the international market. And there's a lot of trade tariffs that have been happening against Chinese commodities like these. So to return to my argument, the excess capacity in coal generation is deliberate because it's trying to solve China's broader economic problem of surplus capital. And absorbing excess labor, material, and financial capital can be done most efficiently through building new infrastructure. So a good chunk of China's surplus has been directed to the building of new coal power generation. And I use a political economy theoretical framework, and you can see that this framework, which looks at the creation and the distribution of wealth and the role of the classes and the role of the state in relation to these activities, can really help us see the material interests at work in the electricity sector. So if you just look at this plant, and here's a plant, here's an image of plant E that I showed you in that overhead of Sealing Hauta, you can see that these plants are really big, bulky things that require a lot of capital to be put in upfront. And typically we think of capital investment as money, but here I want to underscore how capital investments materialize as construction materials, as equipment for electricity generation, and as the labor required to put these things together to make a power plant. So the electricity sector plays a crucial role in enabling capital to circulate through the entire economy because of its forward linkages of providing power to spurring businesses and new economic growth, but also because of its backward linkages, because power infrastructures utilize vast amounts of labor, steel, concrete, and other industrial commodities. So in a nutshell, to answer question 1, I argue that excess coal generation is deliberate because building plants has enabled China to maintain social stability by creating projects that utilizes the country's surplus capital by providing jobs and making use of surplus commodities. But as I said earlier, one of the major problems is that because there is not enough demand for electricity, many coal plants are losing their investment value. In other words, they are being devalued by earning less returns than anticipated or not even earning enough returns to cover the original investment. Now, capital devaluation is something that happens every day. It happens to electricity infrastructure because large amounts of capital are required upfront, as I said, and cost recovery of this capital happens over very long time horizons. So for a coal plant, that is typically 3 to 4 decades. And in infrastructure investments are also subject to devaluation because of unforeseen changes, such as changes in technology, the market, or regulation, depending on where you are. And here you may have recognized that this is actually an image here in the US. This is a stunning image of devaluation happening in mid-air, and that's in the US, and this happened in December of last year when the Navajo coal generation station near Page, Arizona was decommissioned. So the utility owners of that generation station retired it ahead of schedule because the plant was no longer economical due to unforeseen changes in the cheap price of natural gas brought on by advances in hydraulic fracturing over the last decade and a half. So investors take risks every day that they may not recover part or all of their investment. But I'm arguing that in the case of China, devaluation is not a risk, but is inevitable for many new and under construction plants because of the overcapacity, because there's simply not enough market demand. So then the question becomes, knowing that devaluation is inevitable at the sectoral level, what can plant investors do? In other words, how can investors shift the risk of being devalued or buffer against it as much as possible? And then this question of how the risk of devaluation is shifted is tied to questions 2 and 3. Question 2 being, again, why suspend under construction projects instead of orderly and rationally retiring older, less efficient operational plants? And then question 3 being, who wins and who loses from such decisions? So the second half of my presentation today argues that the suspensions of the under construction plants shift the risk of devaluation from operating plants, which if they were retired or suspended would have to stop operating and lose returns because they can no longer sell electricity, to the ones under construction, because if they are suspended while they're being constructed, then they're halted from being put into production, or they're halted from connecting to the grid, and they are then halted from selling electricity to earn returns. And so then the immediate question is, why? Are there differences in who is investing in old plants and who is investing in new ones? So let's take a look at the ownership of power plants in China. So state-owned entities, or SOEs, wholly or mostly own 94% of China's coal generation capacity. So this is all the warm color segments that you see on this pie chart. And this means that power generation SOEs own almost all operational plants and are the investors of under construction plants. However, because of the rise of the contracting system in China in the last 2 decades, power generation SOEs are not fully financially responsible for under construction plants. So power generation SOEs do not bear the full risk of devaluation while power plants are still under construction. And this begins to get at the sequencing problem that we see in question 2. And so then the question is, who bears the risk of devaluation if not these power generation SOEs? And that's getting at the heart of question 3, which is who wins and loses. And I'll spend the rest of this presentation answering this. And the short answer is basically groups of people other than investors of coal plants are bearing this risk. So how do other people bear the risk that is normally undertaken by investors? Construction SOEs are state-owned companies, but they operate in the construction sector and are separate from power generation SOEs, which operate in the power sector. And construction SOEs are contracted by power generation SOEs and are paid a fixed amount for the construction of a new coal plant. And construction SOEs are paid in increments by generation SOEs after they finish segments of the project, and the entire bill for the contract is not settled until the power plant turns on. So when there are delays or suspensions in plant construction SOEs bear devaluation because they are unable to make returns on their own investments. They lose money that they have invested in materials, staff, and workers for construction because they can't get paid by the power generation SOE if construction is incomplete. So construction SOE's money is tied up in half-completed infrastructures. So there are 2 important points for me to pull out at this point. And the first is flipping on the switch, which is signified by this golden electricity lightning sign, is a critical juncture because after the plant gets switched on, the power generation SOE is fully financially responsible for the plant. And this means that construction SOEs will try to expedite the construction as fast as possible to recover their investments. And for generation SOEs, any delays in the completion of construction enables them to delay assuming part of the devaluation risk of that plant. And in an environment where devaluation, as I said earlier, is virtually guaranteed. So the second point I want to pull out is, even though we tend to think of devaluation as early plant retirement, like the Navajo generation station that I showed you earlier, devaluation doesn't happen just during the production phase. It doesn't happen just when the power plant is running. It can happen even before a power plant is put into production, because any delays in earning returns devalues an investment because of the time value of money, meaning money is tied up in investments here and cannot be used elsewhere for more productive returns. So even though we think of investors as the ones who should bear an investment's devaluation risk because they also stand to profit when investment does well, in China's electricity sector, this risk has been increasingly shifted onto other groups because overcapacity makes devaluation inevitable. So we've seen how construction SOEs are one of the groups who is increasingly bearing the risk of coal generation devaluation. And as devaluation risk is shifted onto these SOEs, they will also try to shift the fallout of devaluation onto other groups, namely construction workers. So this shift is done through the mechanisms of 1, construction contracting, and 2, the structure of payments, which positions workers to bear the fallout of devaluation. And this devaluation is manifested in many ways. And the 3 dominant ways that I'll talk about in the talk today is it manifests in workers' living conditions, it manifests in their labor configurations, and it manifests in their work payments. So going back to construction contracting, one of these mechanisms that allow this shifting of devaluation risk, a power generation SOE wants to build a power plant. So they go through, a long permitting and approval process, and then they finally get that approval and they put out a bid proposal for construction work. So different sections of the plant are contracted out to different construction engineering SOEs who oversee engineering and project management for a big piece of this project, like the housing for one of the 2 generators and its boiler. And then each of these construction engineering SOEs contracts parts of their project to subcontractors. And so these subcontractors will do things like lay the foundation for the boiler housing or work on the pipe system. And then each of the subcontractors sometimes hire smaller scale subcontractors who will then oversee teams of 12 to 35 workers. And then workers usually stay on the construction site for a few months, depending on their project. Sometimes a work season goes from March to November in a cold climate like Inner Mongolia, or multiple seasons because it usually takes about 2.5 years to do this work if it's unimpeded. So then the second mechanism is the structure of payments. And as I said earlier, generation SOEs disperse payments at intervals after the construction SOE has completed discrete project pieces, such as the cooling tower that you see in this second image in front of you. And the construction SOE does not pay their subcontractors until after the completion of the subcontractor's discrete project, again, such as building the frame of this cooling tower and so on. So in this contracting system, workers are last to be paid. This is the way that it works generally under normal circumstances. If there are any pauses in construction due either to weather or state order suspensions, such as the NEA suspensions I talked about earlier, stakeholders along this entire contracting system won't receive payments for the piece of construction they are working on at that moment. And this will fall hardest on the worker because they are the last to be paid. So while they may have already put in the labor to finish their part of their subcontract, because the larger structure they're contributing to is unfinished, payments aren't coming down the pipeline.
See, sorry that this sounds a little rushed. If you could wrap up in the next 5 minutes, that will allow some question and answer time.
Okay, I'll try to go as fast as possible. And I hope I'm not talking too fast. I hope I'm still intelligible. So let's pull back and think about the plant on switch junction where devaluation risk is shifted between the 2 types of SOEs. So to buffer themselves against this risk as much as possible, construction SOEs engage in 2 overarching strategies. They expedite construction as fast as possible, and they lower costs as much as possible. And as we just saw, construction contracting and the structure of payments are the mechanisms that allow the construction SOEs to shift the financial, logistical, hiring, training, housing management, health and safety responsibilities of acquiring workers and materials to their subcontractors. And burdened with the responsibilities formerly charged to these corporate entities, smaller subcontractors with far fewer resources to buffer against devaluation absorb a portion of these losses and also are forced to pass off as much of their losses to workers in various forms. And these forms, again, are their living conditions, labor configurations, and work payments. So in terms of workers' living conditions, the urgency to erect housing so construction can begin and the lack of competition and the incentive to minimize costs means that construction SOEs provide poor quality housing, living, and utilities offerings. Workers' dorms are erected quickly and cheaply without enough care for stability, functionality, or safety. And this is kind of what that looks like. And then there are also no common spaces or exercise spaces for workers. So anytime that workers are not working, they're spending in dorms like this. And any of these dorms will host up to 8 to 14 workers. And there are also no heating and no electric heaters in these spaces, especially in cold climates like Inner Mongolia, because this temporary housing has really poor electricity circuitry. And so this gets really hard for workers later on in the season when the weather becomes really frigid. And sometimes the electricity goes out for 2 days at a time. So workers are basically coming home to darkness and they can't even charge their phones, which is the primary device that kind of entertains them and keeps them in touch with family. And workers also eat here after buying their food because there's no communal dining space. There's just like a communal kitchen that you can get food from. And then a lot of times they'll try to save the money on their per diem, which is about 10 to 11 RMB, renminbi, and that's about $1.50 US dollars in 2018 by just eating bowls of rice or instant noodles, which is really lacking in nutrition for how much work they put in. And so the consolidation of work and living areas on this construction site keeps workers within an arm's reach of their work. Workers live a short distance from their construction site, enabling them to start work and to return to it again after break and after each day as fast as possible, which orients them dominantly when they're on the construction site to their identity as a worker and really leaves very little room for other types of identity. Workers also usually don't leave a construction site because they often don't have money to spend because they're not paid until the end of their work season. In terms of labor configurations, a coal plant with two 660 megawatt generators can be finished in China in 26 to 28 months that elsewhere in the world requires 44 to 46 months to complete. And this accelerated timeframe is enabled by around-the-clock construction, which is a day and a night shift that runs 24 hours. Each shift is about 10 hours. And this compressed timeline helps construction SOEs avoid the risk of large-scale devaluation by enabling them to deliver a finished coal product, coal power generator, and get their full payment sooner. It decreases their expenditures by maximizing the use of their paid resources while shortening the duration over which those resources are used. And then contract payments are based on the value of the assets built, not on the number of workers or when they are working. So it doesn't cost the construction SOEs any extra to demand night work. But the effects on workers are really severe. Workers who have more specialized skill sets, such as hanging builders, are required to switch back and forth between day and night shifts. It disrupts their sleep cycles. And then the building of boiler housing, as you can see here, which stands at a height of 130 meters or 20 stories, exposes workers to many dangers, including long-term outdoor exposure, sandstorms in Inner Mongolia, and frigid temperatures. And this is, of course, even more dangerous at night. And then construction work like this is one of the most physically arduous and dangerous lines of work, and it's important to give workers both financial and health protection, but construction SOEs are neither responsible for giving workers paid rest days or health insurance or compensation for illness or injury, and workers rarely rested because they worked every day because a day unworked meant a day unpaid. So if a worker becomes ill or injured, he is forced to choose between health or pay. And this quote from a subcontractor supervisor at Plant E is really telling. He says, workers don't have weekends or holidays. They work until they are no longer able to work. The emphasis is mine. Then they get their paid wages and leave. If they want to go home, they can go home. If they don't want to go home, then they do other easier but less paying work. And so basically this quote is showing how workers bear various forms of wear and tear from their work until their bodies basically break down and their labor is extracted to benefit the construction SOEs and generation SOEs. In terms of workers' payments, basically, as you can see, only about 10% of the total investment of a coal plant in China goes towards paying for labor versus elsewhere, like such as US on the left, about a third or 28% of the plant investments are going towards labor. So workers' labor are definitely consistently undervalued in their work payments. And then other forms of devaluation borne by workers can manifest as delayed payments, no payments, or other types of wage theft. Wage delays have become the norm rather than the exception. So even though in name wages are paid based on the number of days worked, in practice, workers do not receive payments until their contracted project has been completed. And this is my last slide. I'll try to skip the other ones that I have after this. So the impacts of not receiving wages until the completion of a project milestone pervades every part of workers' lives. Withholding wage payments also has a disciplinary effect that prevents them from leaving before their part of the construction is done. And there were many, many reasons to leave: physical exhaustion, low wages, no paid rest days, high risks of exposure and injury, no health insurance, spatial confinement, extreme isolation, austere and substandard living conditions, prolonged periods away from family and friends, and in Inner Mongolia, brutal weather conditions and a shortened work season. Wage delays and theft also pits workers against each other. So at Plant C construction, one of the construction SOEs requested a subcontractor switch their team of 30 workers to a different project segment elsewhere on the site. And the team refused to start work on the new segment until the SOE paid them the 100,000 RMB it had owed them for materials and labor that they had already put in. And the construction SOE said that they couldn't do it because the original segment was still in the process of being completed and had not been paid by the generation SOE and therefore could not pay their workers for another 2 weeks. And the workers argued among themselves how they should proceed. Some wanted to stay at the site, others didn't want to work for another 2 weeks, not knowing whether they would get paid. And I was talking to the workers while all of this was unfurling over the span of a few hours in an afternoon. And within several hours of receiving this news, 4 workers had packed up and was on their way to the bus station. And the fast disintegration of that group jeopardizes pay for the entire group because it decreases their leverage if they want to contend for pay, and it slows down work on a new project if the workers want to take on that new project. And when the 4 workers left, some people tried to stop them, some walked off disappointed and angry, and my main interlocutor, which was a young man in his mid-20s that I was talking to the most during this entire process, looked at the workers as they were taking off, and then he looked at me and tears were rolling down his eyes. And this is the norm and not the exception. Sometimes not getting paid until the Lunar New Year, which is 3 months after the work season and after they leave the site, is something that most workers experience. And sometimes they're just not paid at all. And many workers tell me that they're still owed money from previous years. And in 2018, these delayed wages or non-payments have sometimes resulted in blockades at the door of the construction plant. So I'll skip over my main conclusions, and I just want to say thanks to my funders, the Department of Geography, to everybody who talked to me, as well as my dissertation committee and the doctoral writing group that I have been with the last year, and I'll take any questions. Sorry that took a little bit longer than we thought.
Thanks a whole lot, and thanks for acknowledging the writing group. So folks, on the Zoom side, on YouTube, Lindsay, I see you have a question, but I can't make sense of it. It says audio question about the utility of the payment system. Go ahead and rephrase your question if you can. On the Zoom side, questions, please. If I'm missing a hand raise, please let me know. I'm not. I understand a lot of the folks who are here were intimately involved with your dissertation. So I have a question. Tim has one.
I'll save my questions for the defense.
Oh, smart. See, you gave them some ideas. All right, I'm going to ask a question. Actually, this paradigm of subcontracting. I mean, in the US, a lot of it is because of liability, as well as pay. I'm wondering if that's also a motivation in China, and how do I say this? What are the ramifications of the liability part on the overcapacitization? Sorry for the wrong word that I'm using. The fact that we have more production than we need. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that is part and parcel of that contracting system as well, is the liability. And that's why, you know, these responsibilities that are formally charged to SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, you know, China, for a long time, what the SOEs, the state was the largest employer, and they had a lot of guaranteed benefits for state employees. So I guess this is a challenge of skipping some of your slides, but I did say in the conclusion, now that I remember, one of the reasons why they suspend new plants instead of operational ones is because the people who work in the operational ones are state-owned like state-owned enterprise employees, and they are guaranteed much more benefits. And so if you suspend operational plants, that becomes a much larger social stability problem because it's made very explicit and outright, and you'll have news that are like large amounts of operational plants and like large amounts of SOEs employees are like being retired or let go or like reshuffled, and that's like huge political stability issues. But what happens when you suspend under construction plants with contracted workers is that have no rights, and that, you know, you don't have to guarantee anything to, because the contracting system is that everything happens at the margins. So my overall argument is that devaluation happens at the margins, but it also increases existing disparities in society because these are already very vulnerable and marginalized folks, these construction workers, and they don't have a lot of visibility. And so by doing that, that kind of shifts where devaluation happens and makes it much less visible for the time being, at least. So it functions a lot in that way. I mean, I think part of also the surplus capital problem is another part of this, which is basically that you have large amounts of workers that don't have jobs, and these aren't great jobs, but there are no other alternatives for these kinds of workers. So at least the state can say that these workers do have jobs, but the conditions of these jobs are incredibly poor, and devaluation happens while they're giving workers jobs, even though like half the time these workers aren't getting paid or experiencing wage theft in various forms.
Thank you. That was very insightful. Last question, please, folks.
Tim has a question.
Oh, I actually do have a question. Well, no, I've
I'm
got two
sorry.
questions. And
You just don't show up on my Zoom. Go ahead, please.
That's great work. Really exciting. And my questions, I mean, if you say, you can say, I have no idea, or that wasn't what I was working on, so I'm not going to answer. But my first question is, do you have any sense of similarities and differences between what you're seeing in construction of coal-fired plants compared to nuclear power? And that's something I'm particularly interested in. We're going to be doing a workshop next year on China's nuclear infrastructure construction, particularly exporting. So I'm just curious about whether or not you have any thoughts about that. And then I guess, you know, kind of related to that was whether you've been looking at all China's construction of coal-fired plants outside of China, because I think that, you know, the motivation would be the same in terms of addressing the capital over capacity problem. But, you know, obviously there's going to be different kinds of labor issues and contracting issues and those kinds of things. And just curious whether you've looked at any of that.
Great questions, Tim. I'll answer the harder one first. I haven't been able to talk to anybody who does nuclear plant construction, but I would think that it's very, very similar or potentially worse. I think even though China's been building a lot of nuclear power plants, I think that a lot of them have been quite unsuccessful at a broader scale. I don't know about like the construction side of things, but I think that there's a lot of problems with like getting the nuclear plants to do what they're supposed to do in generating power. There's also a lot of siting problems with nuclear plants. Like they haven't quite figured out the technology to do any sort of like inland nuclear power plants, even though that's been the plan or like the goal for a while now. So I would think that the returns on nuclear power plants are potentially like even like as bad. I mean, this is like talking in very broad strokes, but I think the coal technology is there. Like China is the best coal power plant builder in the world, for sure. They have that down, but I'm not sure if they actually have that nuclear technology down just quite yet. So I'm kind of worried about returns in that part of like the power sector, and that's as far as I can comment. And I don't know what that translates to in terms of like construction labor. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm hoping to do is looking out into the future a couple of years. I like one of my long-term projects to look at coal generation construction projects under the Belt Road Initiative, and like looking at the ways in which other territories are being remade to be kind of like Inner Mongolia and not like Inner Mongolia in other ways, depending on local conditions and the way that local governance kind of goes forward. So that's definitely in the works.
Yeah, thanks for that. The stuff on the nuclear, that's really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah. There might have been a YouTube question. I don't know if they were able to rephrase it.
No, I do not. And I don't believe audio questions are available on YouTube. And I don't see anything typed up. Nevertheless, thank you, Shae, and thank you, Emily.
Emily, did you have a
for
question?
No. It's a clap, I think, in this style. This is the angle. Thanks for staying on late, and good luck wrapping up the rest of your semester. Hope to see you on campus soon. Take good care.
That was great, both of you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Shae and C, if you don't mind, just stay on for a second, please.